Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, affordable housing. We'll give a minute or two for people to join us. So hang tight and we'll be back with you in about a minute. Hello again, everybody. We are still letting people log in, so we will get started on the call in a short minute. We'll give it another 30 seconds or so to give people time to log in. Thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Paul Keeley. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I want to welcome everybody to today's HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, and affordable housing. We have a lot to cover on today's call, some late breaking news, and we'll be sharing that news about what's happening on Capitol Hill related to the infrastructure and spending packages on today's call. We will be joined by Seamus Roller, Executive Director of the National Housing Law Project, who will discuss the new Cdc Eviction Moratorium. Mary Tingerthall, a consultant with the National Alliance to End Homelessness and former Commissioner of Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, will share a series of case studies on converting hotels into permanent housing. We will get the latest from NLIHC's Erase project and rental arrears to stop evictions, about immediate federal, state, and local actions needed to protect renters. We'll get updates from the field and much more. I just want to urge everyone to please, if we have time, we will entertain questions for our panelists. I would ask you just to use the Q&A function for that. I'll be kind of monitoring questions that come in the Q&A box. You'll see that at the very bottom of your screen. You can certainly use the chat function as well. We'll be using it to share links and that kind of thing. If you want to communicate with others on the call, use the chat function. But for Q&A, for questions to the panelists, please use the questions Q&A thing at the very bottom of your screen. So as I said, we have a lot to cover and some late breaking news. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Sadian from the NLIHC team, the Vice President for Public Policy, to tell us what's going on Capitol Hill. Sarah.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's call. So a lot of good news on Capitol Hill. Today, the Senate released their budget resolution, setting the stage for a $3.5 trillion infrastructure package that'll go through budget reconciliation. We've spoken about this before. That's a process that would allow Democrats to pass a really big spending bill, but only with 50 votes in the Senate rather than the typical 60 votes. The budget resolution calls for more than $332 billion for housing and transportation investments, which is really significant. We'll get into that a little bit more about exactly what it means for us. In terms of timing, once the Senate passes the bipartisan infrastructure bill, they're going to immediately turn their attention to passing this budget resolution on the Senate floor. The bipartisan bill is slated to get its final vote at 4 a.m. in the morning on Tuesday, unless they can sort out some kind of an agreement with all 100 senators, so every senator to either cut that down. Whenever they finish the bipartisan deal, they're going to see that vote on the budget resolution on the Senate floor. At that point, it would have to go to the House for approval. Speaker Pelosi hasn't announced any deadline or any time frame for when the House would return to vote on the budget resolution, but we hear it might happen the week of August 23rd, or it might happen after August recess. Either way, this budget resolution is really important because it now allows, once it passes, it allows the Senate Banking Committee and the House Financial Services Committee to put pen to paper and actually draft the legislation about how they're going to divvy up those funds among housing and transportation programs. We don't know exactly how much of the $332 billion would go to transportation programs. It's a really key piece of information that we need to know. So we have an idea of how much would go to housing, but we do have some indications that they're thinking about really robust investments on the housing side. There was a summary document that was shared out from the Senate that pointed to a lot of the priorities that we have in this housing package, with very little mention of transit or transportation, but it's in there, but it's not really highlighted that much. So the summary that they gave out said that they want to both use these funds to create and preserve affordable housing by making historic investments in the National Housing Trust Fund and other programs. They want to improve housing affordability through rental assistance and other measures. And they want to ensure public housing capital investments are included among some other items that they mentioned. That means that all three of the House campaign's top priorities have a really good chance of being included in a significant way in this infrastructure bill. The overall spending, that $332 billion, seems like it is at least in line with the amount that the president requested in his American Jobs Plan, and could even go higher than that. So you might remember that the president had called for $318 billion for housing investments. Not all of that would have gone through the Senate Banking Committee. About $100 billion, $105 billion would have gone through the tax committee, the finance committee that oversees tax-related programs. So that would have left about $213 billion just for housing investments through the Banking Committee. So this amount at $322 billion means that we could be seeing that amount fully funded, and we might even be able to go above that depending on how much is set aside for transit. I will say though, we should not rest on our laurels here. There is a very real possibility that we might see this overall spending limit cut down further. This is sort of the top line mark of what could be included in a bipartisan bill. Of course, we know that Senator Sinema and Manchin have spoken about how they don't feel comfortable with the overall $3.5 trillion package. They might want to see funding cuts going forward. And there's always a possibility that that could come out of housing programs. So there's a number of things that we all need to be doing throughout this month of August when Congress is in August recess, and continue through the fall to make sure that housing gets as robust of an investment as possible. The first thing I want to encourage you guys to do is to sign on to our House campaign petition. And I'm going to ask my colleague, I think, oh, there we go. Look at that. It's already in the chat box. We have 1,000 organizations on the letter so far. If you are not on the letter, we encourage you to sign on. This is a really powerful tool because it allows us to go to any member of Congress, including leadership, including the Banking Committee and House Financial Services Committee, to show that there is robust support for our priorities, including expanding rental assistance, funding for public housing, and for the Housing Trust Fund. So again, if you haven't signed on to that, please do. And if you can, share it with your network, share it with your partners so that we can get as many organizations as possible on that letter. The second thing that would be great for people to do is to contact your senators and representatives and reaffirm the need to include the House campaign priorities in any infrastructure bill. We now have the top line number of what's allowed in the banking through the Banking Committee and Financial Services, but we have no guarantee that they're going to design their bill in a way that really prioritizes households with the greatest needs. That depends on us continuing to put pressure on members of Congress to focus on housing solutions that serve people with the very lowest incomes and those who are the most marginalized. So keep up those conversations with your members of Congress. Over August recess, they will be back in their states and districts. This is a good time to set up meetings or attend town halls. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with COVID and whether or not those events would be in person going forward, but you certainly can participate virtually going forward over the next month and so. I do want to just make a quick mention of the two bills that we had been building co-sponsors for. Chairwoman Waters introduced her Housing as Infrastructure Act and her Ending Homelessness Act. And the release of this budget resolution does have an impact on both of those bills. One, we were working before this budget resolution was released to get as many co-sponsors to our Housing as Infrastructure Act. In part, that's because we wanted to send a message to House and Senate leadership that they should provide a really robust allocation for housing in this infrastructure package, and we got that. Of course, we didn't get nearly as much as what Chairwoman Waters included in her bill. Her bill would have provided about $600 billion. This is $332 billion. So there's a difference there. So for right now, I'd say you can point to the Housing as Infrastructure Act and the Ending Homelessness Act in terms of asking your members of Congress to become co-sponsors. That's a really important thing to do. But it seems in the scheme of things, maybe now a little less important in this moment. And instead, we should be turning our attention towards really highlighting and driving home the need for the House campaign priorities in any bill that they put together. So emphasizing the need for rental assistance, for public housing dollars and housing trust fund dollars seems like the best use of our time between now and when the bill eventually passes, hopefully. So I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions from folks on the call.
Thank you, Sarah. It looks like we just have one question so far, and I'm not sure the answer to it. Last I heard, Senate leadership wanted Section 9 capital grants at $80 billion. Have we heard anything more on that?
So I do know that Senator Schumer had been calling for $80 billion for public housing, which is a good indication, but we haven't heard anything more. And we probably won't hear anything about how the committees are thinking about splitting up this $332 billion for housing and for transportation until we actually see the bill text. And by then, it'll be very difficult to change. So all of the work that we have ahead of us or going into this bill, all of that's going to happen. And finally, at the end, we'll see what the end result is. Before then, we can't take anything for granted. We know that there's a lot of support for public housing dollars, for example, but it's now competing against all of the other priorities that every other member of Congress has for housing. And so if we want to make sure that we have rental assistance, public housing dollars, and housing trust fund dollars, we have to keep the pressure on Congress to focus on those resources. That's it.
Sarah, just real quick, how many organizations are currently signed on to the HoUSed campaign letter? Approximately?
Yeah, so far we have more than 1,000 organizations on board. We would love to see more. It looks like there might be an issue with the link. And so I will try to see if we can get that an updated list, an updated version when I get off the call. The importance of that letter is that it really shows members of Congress how broad of support these priorities have. So if you've already signed on, you still have work to do. You can share that letter with your networks. You can share it in your communities. You can get other organizations or elected officials on board. If you haven't signed on, that's an easy one. You can just sign on through the link.
Okay, two other questions. I know you know the answers to. Are we still asking for $45 billion in the Housing Trust Fund? Are there specific numbers we should ask for? And then secondly, could you repeat the top line numbers, total amount of reconciliation bill versus the amount within that's dedicated to housing and transportation?
So overall, right now, the budget resolution is for a $3.5 trillion package. Of that total amount, up to $332 billion is dedicated towards housing and transportation. We don't have a better idea of exactly how that's broken up. For now, we should keep asking for the total amount of resources that we wanted. So set at least $70 billion for public housing, at least $45 billion for the Housing Trust Fund. Things do get a little, I think we need to come back to folks about what our number is going to be for rental assistance. As you know, we had been asking for rental assistance to cover every eligible person. At this amount, at $332 billion, there's not enough to cover everybody who is eligible. And so we need to go back to the drawing board for a day to think through with our partners about what is an amount that could be included in this bill that would make a really significant impact. But we have to get back to you guys. So for now, I would just emphasize the need for robust funding for rental assistance, or significant funding for rental assistance, and not put a dollar amount on it just yet. And we will come back to you with a more accurate number of what we should be pushing for.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much, Sarah. It looks like that's it in terms of questions at this point. Of course, please stay on. You can answer other questions as they come in. But as always, great summary. Thank you so much. Okay, we will now move on to Seamus Roller, Executive Director of the National Housing Law Project, longtime friend of the coalition, to talk to us about the new CDC eviction moratorium. Seamus, take it away.
Thanks, Paul. So I imagine most of you have already seen that the CDC issued a new order on evictions on August 3rd. So that order lasts 60 days and it will expire on October 3rd. A couple of things to sort of know about it. One is that in many ways it's similar to the previous CDC order on evictions. It has most of the same provisions. The big difference is that it's focused on counties with high levels of COVID infection. So it's at county level, whether it applies or not. And so the terms that they use at the CDC are substantial or high levels of community transmission. And what you can do is look, the CDC has a COVID tracker on their website that goes county by county, and you can look and see whether the county that you're in or counties that you're working in are covered by the order. In practice, it's about 80% of the counties are covered, and about 90% of renters nationally are covered by the order as it stands right now. That could obviously change depending upon how community transmission is affected, because it has to be a sort of 14 days that you're out of the category before it kicks in. And so, there's going to be increasing confusion. It's been difficult enough, I think, for tenants to understand whether they were covered and how to get coverage. There is a new declaration on there. The declaration also requires that you check a box that you live in one of the counties that's covered by the order. So there's been a lot of pushback from advocates, including from the coalition, around this idea that tenants are supposed to understand whether their county is covered or not. So hopefully they will remove that box, but it's one more thing as part of the declaration overall. But the declaration, if you signed it previously, you don't have to issue a new declaration in order to be covered by the new order. So the old declarations that any of the tenants did, those ones will be good for this order as well. So there are a lot of legal discussion going on around the order and around how this is going to play out. So there's been quite a bit of news that has said that the Supreme Court in some ways said that the CDC order was unconstitutional. I just want to clear that out. First of all, the Supreme Court did not make a ruling on the constitutionality of the previous CDC order. What happened is that in the Alabama Realtors case, there was a DC district court judge who found it unconstitutional, and then she stayed her order pending appeal. So her order didn't take effect pending the appeal in the case. Both the DC Circuit Court and the Supreme Court chose not to remove the stay on that decision. But in the Supreme Court, it was a 5-4 decision, Kavanaugh being the fifth vote, deciding not to remove the stay of that earlier ruling. And in Kavanaugh's concurring opinion, what he said is that he thought that the CDC order was unconstitutional, but because of the fact that it was expiring and because some of the equities issues, he decided to side with the majority in that opinion. And so all of what Kavanaugh said in that is what lawyers like to call dicta. It's not ruling. It's not part of the opinion overall, and it doesn't change what that ruling is. It does indicate where the Supreme Court might be if this case were to get back to them. And I think, certainly so some of the legal vulnerabilities of the case overall. But one, it takes a while for a case to get to the Supreme Court, and it's certainly not a sure thing of how the court will address it, given how much the world has changed just in the couple of months since this was at the Supreme Court. I think the big thing that is lost in all this is sort of one of the things that we think about at the National Housing Law Project is what's called the ratification doctrine. And that just means that if an agency does something of questionable legality, but then it is ratified by Congress later on, then that action is held to be constitutional. And in this case, the bill that was passed, the Consolidated Appropriations Act that was passed in December of 2020, extended the moratorium. And we really think that effectively ratified the CDC's power to issue an eviction moratorium. And that's what the strongest legal argument that we think for why this is valid. I think the thing for those of you who are working directly with tenants is that at NHLP, we think about the CDC moratorium and the challenges that go on to it. I think it's good not to think about this as a blanket moratorium, but to think about it as one of the many tools that are available to help tenants stay in their homes. And so this has been throughout its history since September of last year, a difficult order for tenants to take advantage of all of the protections that it offers. It's complex. And this extension provides another tool to think about how to keep people in their homes, but it often works best if there's an attorney involved in the case, if there's an advocate involved helping a tenant move through this process. And that it will remain, I think, difficult for many tenants to access the protections that are involved, and that whatever you can do to help them get a lawyer, to get access to an advocate who can help them through that process, the more effective those protections will be. That there may be other protections that are available, state moratoriums, diversion programs within courts, that all those things layered upon one another will help keep people in their homes as we move forward. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Seamus. So a couple of questions. There were a couple that are sort of the same kind of question, which is, does the moratorium cover renters who were evicted August 1st and 2nd, or who received notices between midnight July 31st and August 3rd? Any word about that?
So tenants that were physically evicted, right, that during that time period, it does not cover them. It is not retroactive. And so there's nothing to be done for those renters. However, renters who received an eviction notice, so the CDC order on evictions covers the entirety of the evictions. It mostly covers the physical eviction. So if you got a notice, that notice is still valid, but the eviction process shouldn't be able to move forward if you issue a declaration. And so you want to make sure that anybody who got a notice is issuing a declaration if they haven't done so already, and they should be covered by the CDC order. But for those folks that where the full eviction happened during those 2 days, there's nothing to do for those folks.
Thanks, Seamus. A question here from Sarah Hasmer is, will the 2020 CDC declaration form still be acceptable? She notes that there's not a French translation of the new declaration.
So usually what what they say is that it has to be substantially similar. And the only real difference is the checkbox around the counties. So I don't see any real reason why the old declaration shouldn't be effective. You all know this, that some landlords will try to contest that. It provides a little bit more risk there, but my opinion is that the old one should be effective, especially given the translation issues.
Okay, and another question actually relates to something I was going to ask you is, we're hearing about courts just saying, well, we're going to ignore the new CDC eviction notification. And as Sarah Hasmer again asked, is there a right to appeal A judge in Phoenix ignored the previous CDC eviction order and issued an eviction for July 26th for a mother that we're helping. Under this CDC eviction order, is there any way tenants can appeal judges who ignore it if their county has substantial or high transmission rates?
That's going to be under state law. And so almost all state eviction laws have an appeal process. And so we really are encouraging the attorneys to appeal any of these cases that they have. And so I put a link to the memo, sort of some of the legal arguments that we think that you should be making if you have judges that are going to try and argue that it's unconstitutional. One of which is just that the CDC and the federal government need to be a party to the case if you're going to rule on the constitutionality of it. And so that memo that we put out can be useful, but also that, you know, in most cases, you're able to appeal eviction judgments up to a higher court, and lawyers should really be working on appealing those cases.
Great. Another anonymous attendee said, are there any tools, scripts available online that could be used for advocacy to state and local officials regarding extension or creation of eviction moratoriums?
So Eric Dunn, who's our director of litigation, who's been on this call a couple of times, he just put out an article in Shelter Force that came out today about what kind of tools need to be pushed to the local and the state level. That's a good resource. Also on our website are a whole bunch of, we have a model state eviction moratorium and a model local eviction moratorium as well. It has a number of other provisions in it. And so those are resources to you about thinking about what to do at the local and state level.
Great. I'm going to ask you one more, Seamus, and then let you go. This one came in before the call, but it said, is there guidance about how PHAs can handle residents pending eviction due to non-payment of rent?
Well, I mean, one, I think, you know, PHAs shouldn't be moving forward with any non-payment evictions. There's so many options for housing authorities right now. And, you know, thanks to the great work of the coalition and other groups, we've made sure that rental assistance is available to subsidized tenants also. And so, you know, one of the things we push for is for HUD to ban all evictions in subsidized properties on their own, absent, you know, sort of the CDC moratorium as well. So I think PHA should think about the guidance that's available around rental assistance programs and tap into that. And then, you know, we're available as a resource for, you know, for advocates who are working with housing authorities. We're really interested in whether any housing authorities are moving forward with evictions around non-payment and are trying to push back both from a policy standpoint and from a legal standpoint around those evictions. It just seems like, you know, one of my worries is that if you're evicting subsidized tenants, those are the folks who already are at the lowest incomes, are most likely to become homeless after their evictions. Did I answer that, Paul? I don't know.
Yes, very good, very good. Thank you, thank you. Seamus, you may have to run. I don't, you know, I don't want to keep you, but if you had a moment or two, there are a couple more questions that have come in. If you want to take a shot at answering them in the Q&A box, that would be great. If not, we can follow up with you. But in the interest of time, we're going to move on in our agenda. I just want to say thank you so much for joining us on this call and sharing this valuable information.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay, take care, Seamus. Thanks. Okay, we will now move on to Mary Tingerthall, who's a consultant with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. As I mentioned before, she was a longtime commissioner of Minnesota Housing, the finance agency in Minnesota, a longtime friend of the coalition and of the National Housing Trust Fund. She appeared on a congressional briefing that we did about the trust fund a few years ago. It's great to have Mary with us. Who's going to talk a little bit about converting hotels into permanent housing, some case studies from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. So Mary, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks very much, Paul.
Okay, take it away.
So really glad to be in front of this audience to talk about some important work that the National Alliance to End Homelessness has asked me to do over the last several months. And if I could ask for my slides to be brought up, thank you very much. I started work with them late last year, and if you could move to the next slide, please. We framed up a really quick project that has turned out to be several months more long than I imagined. Initially, the Alliance really wanted to take a look at programs and projects around the country that had been funded back in 2020 to convert hotels to housing. And they really wanted to gain some policy insights. And I know that they worked with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and many others as they developed proposals that eventually became the ARP legislation. And I have to tell you that as a longtime financer of permanent supportive housing and housing in general, affordable housing, I was a skeptic when I heard about hotels to housing. And so I went into it with a proposal that we looked to see if truly this was a viable option for creating permanent housing, and if it produced housing faster and at a lower cost than you could do new construction and still end up with quality housing. And we reached the conclusion very quickly that that was in fact the case in many circumstances around the country. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. So back in the January, February timeframe, we used some of this research to provide input to the policymakers that were developing the ARP legislation back in March, and then included some comments to HUD in particular about the home ARP program, which some of you may be aware HUD is currently developing and hoping to release guidance in the fall of this year. And then the final step of the project was to actually develop case studies to assist all of you, states, localities, developers, owners, and service providers with future program development and implementation. So the case studies are intended to be very much focused on lessons learned and key success factors in places around the country that have already done hotel to housing conversions, and to provide you with an immediate resource for deciding whether hotel to housing conversions are right for you in your state or your locality. Next slide, please. So just recently, the Alliance launched a particular part of their website, and you see the address there. And if one of the staff could put that in the chat as well, I'd appreciate that. There are 4 what I call program level case studies. The one that probably everyone has heard about is HomeKey in California, where that program was used to create over 6,000 units of housing in California for people who are homeless. So this is not a broad range of housing. This is all housing that has been created in the last year for people who were homeless and are now living housed. So I really want to emphasize that the production levels of these programs, given that they were in specific states, are really quite remarkable. In an overall case in California, Oregon, Vermont, and Hennepin County, which is the county where Minneapolis is located in Minnesota, they were able to address 5% of their total point-in-time count homeless population with this strategy. So it's worth at least a look at your on your part. We also are producing 7 project-level case studies, 4 of which are currently posted, and the others will be coming in the next couple of weeks or so. So we are looking to provide you with some very practical information. You'll find that in each of the case studies that there is contact information for people in the localities that are covered in either the program level case studies or the project level case studies. The 3 additional ones that are coming are in Minneapolis, in suburban Portland, Oregon, and in suburban Burlington, Vermont. So watch for those as well. One of the things that was interesting to me is that several of the programs allowed for conversion into what's being called interim housing or non-congregate shelter in some cases, and then with a game plan to be converted into permanent housing. Of the 7 case studies that you'll see 3 of them are currently operating as interim housing, and 4 of them have actually already converted into permanent housing. I want to make just a few bullet points on what I took away from doing these case studies. First of all, in every case, it was found that doing these conversions was in fact faster and less expensive than doing new construction. Even in probably the highest cost area, San Diego, which has converted 2 residence inns to permanent supportive housing, the unit cost on a per unit basis was $100,000 less than it would have been to create the same type of housing, starting with new construction. And people actually moved into the housing in December of last year. So it's not for everyone. It's not a panacea, but there are some really compelling case studies to say that it is something that's worth looking at. It does, however, require a really specific strategy. You're looking at your community or your state, or even as a developer, it does take a focus that's a little different than might be traditional construction. It's not just about capital costs as well. And some of the more successful programs, including one that is not written up as a case study, is in King County, Oregon, where they've provided a funding stream that provides both capital costs and ongoing operating and service costs. Another thing I'd like to note, 2 of the case studies, the one in San Diego and the one in Fort Worth, involved a partnership with public housing authorities, and both of them involve project-based vouchers that are really worth looking at if that's a way to keep those projects going over the long term. And finally, I really encourage you, as you're looking in your communities, how you're going to approach the home ARP program when the guidance comes out. Think now about whether there's a place in your program for the conversion of existing buildings into housing. And it doesn't have to be just hotels. There are also some successful conversions of convents, nursing homes, and even residential treatment facilities that can successfully be converted. If I could have the next slide, please. One other thing I'd like to call your attention to, the Alliance teamed up with the National Housing Conference, and 2 webinars are posted on their website at this link. And we actually took the case studies that are posted on the Alliance's website and had program presenters. So there's one from June that is at the program level with presentations from California, Oregon, and Vermont. So there's nothing like hearing it from the people who actually ran the programs. And then one in July that had local level presenters from King County, Hennepin County in Minnesota, and Fort Worth, Texas. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Paul to see if there are any questions. I just want to let you know this resource is out there. If you're thinking at all about this, please take a look at the case studies, because I think you'll find a lot of really practical information.
Thank you so much, Mary. I did have a question, but then you answered it yourself. It's about the whole question of the ongoing operating costs of these conversions, and you touched on that. So thank you for that. Is there any word on when the guidance will be coming out on the ARP home program?
Sarah might be a little better informed than I am, but what I would say is it's going to be in the fall. Right now, one thing that people can do is sign up on the HUD Exchange website. HUD is providing some technical assistance sessions. I think there's one later this month and one in September. And the one in September will actually focus on case studies. You do have to sign up on the HUD Exchange HomeARP website to get access to those webinars. You have to register, but they are providing those in preparation for people needing to amend their consolidated plans. So one of the cautions I have is this is not the home program. And it's something that I think the organizations like the National Low Income Housing Coalition could help people to begin to think about the things that are really different. And what's really different is the ability to acquire buildings like hotels for conversion. That just really hasn't been very feasible under the traditional home program. It's not a perfect fit for the very best funding source for this program, but I think with some good focus locally or at the state level, that it can really be a pretty powerful tool. And keep in mind that this is a resource that is already funded. There's $5 billion out there. So planning for it now, I think, is really, really important.
Thank you very much, Mary. One other question here is, to what extent will families be able to be served, or have they been served thus far through hotels to housing?
There is one of the case studies is in Vermont. That's a program called Susan's Place. And that was an extended stay hotel where a number of the units were actually combined into a smaller number of units, but larger units. And that program is available for families. So depending on what approach you take, it's often possible without a lot of rehab costs to kind of deconvert the number of units so that you can get larger units. And that's definitely eligible under the HomeARP program.
Okay, one more question and then we'll let you go. There may be others that come in if you have a moment or two to answer some in the Q&A box. But Ann Faust asks, can this model be used with distressed shopping malls?
So it's there's a lot of folks nationally looking at properties other than sort of close to residential. People have talked about the fact that there'll be a lot of excess office space. There's also the question of shopping malls and things like that. One of the barriers to successful conversion in properties like that is the shortage of bathroom facilities. So oftentimes, for example, a office building will have all of the bathroom facilities in the.
Mary, it looks like you just went on mute
Sorry, I bumped my pad. Oftentimes, residential codes and just common sense mean that you want your units to be on the outside of the building, but they're far away from where existing bathroom facilities are. So it gets to be a very expensive proposition. I know that one example of a large kind of big box kind of building in the Twin Cities, it was used for an indoor tiny home village. So that might be an option that people want to look at for some of those more big box. But the reason that people have gravitated towards hotels, nursing homes, convents, residential treatment facilities, et cetera, is that they already have a lot of bathrooms. And that's what it turns out you need, bathrooms and kitchens, if you're going to do conversions to permanent housing.
Right. Okay, Mary, thank you so much for this phenomenal information. I'm sure it'll be very, very useful for those checking out the case studies. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. And people should feel free to contact me as well. My contact information is on the PowerPoint, and I can put it in the chat as well.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, thanks again, Mary. Take care. Okay, now we're going to move to our field updates, and we'll begin with Nancy Brune from the Gwynn Center in Nevada. Nancy?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Brooke and NLIHC, for allowing me to share what's happening in Southern Nevada, which arguably was ground zero of the pandemic. So I'm Nancy Byrne. I'm the Executive Director of the Gwynn Center, which is a nonpartisan research center policy lab now affiliated with the University of Nevada, Reno. Next slide, please. Next slide. So last summer, we partnered with the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project, and we completed an analysis which projected that between 118,000 to 142,000 households in Nevada could face eviction risk. Now, for Clark County, where Las Vegas is located, and we account for 75% of Nevada's population, we estimated that between 89,000 and 107,000 households in Southern Nevada could face eviction risk. And we acknowledged at the time that total overall impact would depend on unemployment rates, state and national eviction moratoria, and the distribution of state and local benefits and assistance programs. Our analysis, fortunately, was used to advocate and successfully pass state, local eviction moratoria, local and state rental assistance programs, and a new eviction mediation court. So the good news is that the attention that we brought to the issue actually translated into policy change and resources. Next slide. So specifically, a recent estimate found that Clark County has distributed about $162 million in both rental and utility assistance to about 90,000 families in Southern Nevada in areas of greatest need. And in this slide on the left-hand side, we map the Urban Institute's Emergency Rental Assistance Prioritization Index for Clark County. And the darker areas show the communities with greatest need for emergency rental assistance. We then looked at where Clark County had actually distributed its CARES housing assistance rental assistance programs. And the darker areas on the right side of the slide in that map illustrate where communities have received greater distribution of rental assistance programs. So the good news is that there is some alignment. The darker shaded areas on the left align or map nicely to the darker shaded areas on the right. And so again, it looks like our local and state rental assistance programs have been helping those communities with greatest need and helping people stay in their homes. But despite the good news that the rental assistance programs are working, we do have some concerns, both short-term and long-term. First, with respect to our short-term concerns, data from the U.S. Census Bureau Household Pulse Survey indicates that 50,000 households in Nevada in June indicated they were likely to be evicted in the next 2 months. And as of this morning, Nevada public officials have not yet confirmed whether the new federal eviction moratorium applies to renters living in those vulnerable counties. The argument is that our legislature passed legislation this spring, which provides assistance to renters. And so local public officials have suggested that the federal eviction moratorium is now in conflict with recent state legislation. So this is an ongoing conversation. Second, with respect to our long-term concern, next slide, please. We mapped historical data here in Nevada, and we found that as our economy, next slide, please, that as the economy starts to recover, we did observe that evictions also start to increase. So in this slide, we looked at, you will see that post the Great Recession, where Nevada was also hit pretty badly, the unemployment rate, which is green, the green dotted line, it peaked at almost 14% in September of 2010, and then started to decline rapidly. And you'll see at the same time that as the unemployment rate started to decline, eviction filings started to increase rapidly. And so we are using this analysis and sharing this analysis to suggest to policymakers that while there is a short-term crisis with evictions still, we should expect, based on historical data, to think that or consider the fact that there could be a second wave of evictions 4 to 6 years down the road when the ARP funds have been dispersed. And so we are encouraging policymakers to take that into account in their planning efforts and also in their budgetary allocations, as we look at the long term. So we will be staying on top of this issue, and we look forward to working with NLIHC to stay abreast of the situation. Thank you again for allowing Southern Nevada to share what's going on.
Nancy, thank you so much. Great information, great work, great example of using data to track what's happening and then to use it for policy advocacy. Just outstanding. I don't see any questions for you right now. There may be some that come in, but I think that right now we're good to go. So thank you so much, Nancy, for that presentation. Outstanding work. Okay, we will move on now to Teresa Hardy, President of NAACP Dekalb County in Georgia. Teresa. Teresa, are you there? I'm looking to my colleagues, see if Teresa had to drop off. Let's just see here. Okay, what we'll do is, I'm just looking here. Yeah, Teresa, I think Teresa's on. Teresa, can you hear me? Maybe she's having some technical difficulties. What we'll do is we'll move on to our next field update and then come back to Teresa when she's able to join us. So joining us from Alabama is David Young from the Alabama Housing Finance Authority. David? David, are you there? There you go, David. The floor is yours.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss ERA Alabama's Imminent Initiative, Imminent Eviction Prevention Initiative. Again, my name is David Young, and I'm the multifamily administrator for the Alabama Housing Finance Authority, and also the designated contact for the authority's Emergency Rental Assistance Program. As all of you well know, administering the Emergency Rental Assistance Program has been a challenge on several fronts. We had to rapidly develop in terms of the initial staffing plan, getting a online application portal built to accept online applications, and also to do outreach and build a payment system to pay not only tenants, but the landlords, as well as the multiple utility companies that are statewide here in Alabama. Most importantly, we had to work to attempt to develop a timely response based on the high volume of applications that we received. Our Emergency Rental Assistance Program, on our first launch date, which was March 1st, we received over 10,000 applications as a part of that process. By the end of the first week, we had simply over 30,000 applications that had come in. Currently, to date, we have culled through over 57,000 applications, of which about roughly 81% of those applications meet Treasury guidelines for priority funding based on income eligibility of being at or below 50% of area median income. So that's a real challenge within itself. While the initial interest and number of applications that we received were definitely and significantly more than we anticipated, the pace of our review and approval in terms of processing those applications is increasing. And the program is maturing as the landlords are getting more efficient in terms of learning how to use our systems. Therefore, each week now, we are seeing an increase in funding levels and both in terms of number of applications and dollar amounts on a weekly basis. We definitely understand the sense of urgency to get money out to those in need and are working every week to refine and improve our processes so that we can make payments more quickly. One of the ways that we've sought to refine our processes includes the development of our Imminent Eviction Prevention Initiative, which is based on a similar program implemented by the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs, excuse me. Based on the high volume of applications that we've received and that we're processing, we wanted to streamline or expedite applications for applicants who had submitted an application to ERA Alabama and also had received a recent eviction notice and court filing. Since we had previously worked with Legal Services Alabama with our Hardest Hit program, we wanted to continue to build on that relationship. So we contacted one of the team members from one of the regional office to find out general information about the number of eviction cases they were handling, how they were processing those, and just trying to go through that process to determine how we could aid in that process. Based on the outreach efforts that we had in June, we initiated a collaborative venture with Legal Services Alabama called the Imminent Eviction Prevention Initiative. ERA Alabama works with the legal services lawyers to expedite cases for renter households who have submitted a rental application online with ERA Alabama. They've been served with a formal eviction notice or court case filing, and they're eligible to remain in their households based on the landlord's separate ERA application, the landlord's separate ERA Alabama application and agreement. Using this process, we've been able to expedite approvals for requests generally within 2 to 3 business days of that receipt of that request from the attorney. And we've been able to turn around payments for rental and utility assistance within 10 to 14 days of that approval. Of course, the time frame can vary dependent upon how cooperative the landlord is in participating. But generally, we've found that the legal services team has been great in terms of being a mediator between ERA Alabama and the tenant, and in working with that landlord to get them to understand what the program requirements are and to solicit their participation to ensure that the tenant is able to stay in their residence as long as payment is received. To date, we've had 20 different attorneys from across the regional offices of Legal Services Alabama to participate in the program. As of July 30th, we've assisted 81 Alabama families since June in terms of expediting their applications. We have another 25 cases that are pending in the hopper for expedited processing. So we anticipate that process or the number of applications to continue to grow. And we are just happy or excited about our ability to be able to expedite those cases to keep them from the eviction process. Some important points to note about the program is that the tenant's attorney sends a request directly to our staff with that request, including a executed client authorization and a release form, which allows the client's attorney to communicate directly with the ERA staff regarding the tenant's application. So that way, if there are issues related to additional information needed by the attorney, the legal needed from the actual tenants, the legal services attorney are able to work with their client to quickly get that information uploaded to the application application website in order to facilitate as timely processing of their application as can be. The attorney also, in the request to us, provides the eviction notice and court filing. information. So last, one of the things that we do require again is that the tenant and landlord must complete their applications online, and the landlord must agree not to evict the tenant in accordance with the Treasury guidelines. Importantly, the initiative is not restricted to just legal services attorneys. We've worked with other attorneys who are working or helping their clients either on a volunteer or a pro bono capacity to prevent the evictions of those clients. So we look forward to, and we're expecting for this program to expand out past legal services attorney, as well as grow within the Legal Services Alabama organization in terms of the number of cases that we are able to help. Importantly, the program applies to those that have already completed an application, or if not already registered, the applicant can complete the application online, and this is typically with the assistance of a legal services attorney, with that attorney or legal counsel providing immediately those documents that we mentioned, the court filing documents, the eviction documents, and that legal consent, and we're still able to assist in forwarding or assisting in terms of the expedited processing of those cases. So all I can say is that we do have challenges with the volume of number of applications that we have, but this is an example of, I think, a creative approach to us kind of reaching out to various organizations and figuring out a way to prioritize and to help prevent the eviction cases that are out there now. And I think we're doing a pretty good job with that, and we want to expand on doing that further. So that's kind of in a nutshell, kind of what we're able to do with our imminent eviction prevention initiative. And I'm glad to have this opportunity to tell you what we're doing here in Alabama.
Thank you so much, David. Just a couple questions here. There's a more involved one that I think if you have time to respond to, about handling future disasters and disaster response, but just a couple of quick ones. Do you proactively contact the renter who's facing eviction, or do they have to contact you? Is it a case where, because you're working with the courts and you're collaborating, which is a great example of collaborating between the ERA program, the courts, and legal aid attorneys, are you able to proactively begin the process, or do they have to contact you?
Well, actually, we don't. Now, the Texas program, I think they work directly with the courts. The state of Alabama is not structured that way. In terms of working with our clients, we have done, I think, a pretty good job of outreach with our tenants that are facing eviction, that we've asked them to consult with either a Legal Services Alabama attorney or other attorney, so that we can facilitate that process of them contacting us so that we can expedite their requests.
Okay, all right. So they have to reach out to a legal aid attorney, and then legal aid attorney is connecting that individual with you.
Yeah, and an important note regarding that is that typically a majority of the cases that are being worked through Legal Services Alabama are those cases where the clients are actually income eligible, and there is a cross section of those cases that where their tenants or their clients have already have a pending application with ERA Alabama.
Great. Just a combination question here. Do you know what percentage of Alabama tenants facing eviction have legal representation? And then the second part is, who pays for the legal aid attorneys and the legal fees?
For the legal aid attorneys, you'll have to contact Legal Services Alabama for that question. In terms of the actual data, that's one of the questions that we have pending, that even with Legal Services Alabama, our question to them would be centered around how many cases do you have that are eviction cases for cause related only to non-payment. And they do not have a database currently that would provide that level of detail as subcategories of information out there.
All right, fantastic. There are a few other questions in here. If you have time to take a look at them, David, that'd be great. Otherwise, I just want to say thank you so much. I do hope that the ERA Alabama overall program looks at, ways to streamline. I love when you talk about streamlining the process for those that are contacting legal aid attorneys, but I do hope that the program itself broadly is looking at how do they streamline, use direct to tenant assistance, and how do they maybe use self-attestations to simplify their documentation requirements. Thank you so much for sharing this valuable information.
Again, thank you for the opportunity.
All right, take care, David. And I think we are happy to have Teresa Hardy back with us. Teresa, are you there? Okay.
Yes, I am.
All right, fantastic, great. So this is Teresa Hardy, president of NAACP, Dekalb County, Georgia, is going to talk to us a little bit about what's going on in Georgia.
Yes.
Thanks, Teresa.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to provide an update from an advocacy civil rights organization. As you know, NAACP is 112 years old, and we we advocate on behalf of people, making sure that there's fair and just in all areas. Because our topic today is around housing, I will put a little bit emphasis on what we're doing from that perspective. Another key thing to understand is that we are in a crisis, and that is one of the things that we've known for a while here. Our crisis includes health, economics, and democracy, and all three of them together has put us in this a situation where we're talking about the impacts of homelessness or eviction cases, housing as a whole. I wanted to just kind of give a little preview of what NAACP has done and is doing as it relates to the housing crisis that we're all in. One thing, pre-COVID, we were already looking into initiatives that related to homelessness and affordability. So one of our initiatives for the NAACP included a process and resource initiative to make sure that we have a plan for homelessness to housing. And housing doesn't mean ownership. Housing means making sure you have shelter. The key here is to not have people on the street living in DeKalb County. So that was one of our key things pre-COVID. And we have been working with different organizations. Georgia ACT is one of our main sponsors and partners in these initiatives as it relates to our community. When we talk about homelessness to housing, it was categorized in this manner as it relates to affordable homes. And what we were discussing pre-COVID was, what is affordable homes? Affordability came from the, if you look at the way federal government looks at it, it looks at it from a perspective of 30% of your income. So if we look at it just from the perspective of 30% of our income, we would know that we have an issue, especially if we look at what our minimum wage is. For the state of Georgia, the minimum wage is $5.15. And for the federal, it's $7.25, which gets us to why we have an economic crisis. If you look at the fact that we're trying to get to $15 an hour, it still would get us to what I call affordability on homes. $15 an hour will only get us to about $30,000 a year, $28,000 to be exact, but if we want to just round it off. But in the state of Georgia, there's no one where to live for $900 a month as it relates to our families, just a basic family. So we have a problem as it relates to economics, health, and our democracy all in together. So when we talk about affordable homes, again, we are not on the path to affordability from that perspective. And all of this is pre-COVID. Our rental assistance program that we've had in the past kind of followed the same type of guidelines. And if you look at what, from a federal perspective, everything is based on income. Some people, if you were already in the system, you may not get the same assistance that that if depending on your actual current situation. But when we got into COVID, everyone's situation kind of came out to be the same. So the other piece, what I wanted to kind of talk about here in our advocacy work is the fact that we're now at the point of the moratorium. And pre-moratorium, we have in the past worked with a lot of different organizations, become one of the organizations to actually help with COVID relief. On last year, we were able to assist several, almost 100 people to keep them off the streets. And that rental assistance actually came from not just your mortgage, but also your rental in your apartment, but also the hotels as well. And we also helped with the utility bills as well. And now that we're going into the 60-day moratorium that Dekalb County, I must say Dekalb County actually led in actually making the moratorium be extended prior to CDC. And I'm proud to be a part of a county who takes on leadership to a whole nother level. And in that, it focused on the high level of community transactions, transition as it relates to where COVID is impacting us. So we've talked about that a little bit. But what I wanted to bring out as it relates to DeKalb County and the leadership here is we are going to be looking at servicing 100% of the past due up to 12 months. 100% up to 12 months is what we're going to be working with in DeKalb County. And remember, what we're trying to do is not have evictions. We're trying to reduce the number of evictions and work with the actual landlords to make sure people can stay in their homes after this moratorium. Right now, we have 1,700 writs that was on the list and about 3,000 cases as it relates to the tenant landlord situation. But we are planning to work together collaborative with other agencies to make sure that in DeKalb County, as well as Georgia, that we come up with a plan that will keep people in their homes. And I will be willing to answer any questions.
I was having a hard time unmuting there. Thank you, Teresa. I just want to say it is so important, and I just commend you that NAACP is playing this role, this leadership role on housing. The national NAACP is a steering committee member of NLIHC's Opportunity Starts at Home campaign. And that's just phenomenal. And they've been really active and phenomenally involved in affordable housing. It's so great to hear your chapter so involved in this leadership role as well. There's a question here from Jerry. Yours is a leadership chapter within NAACP. How might we grow the affordable homes advocacy capacity in other NAACP chapters? Can local NAACP chapters sign on to the NLIHC advocacy letter discussed on this call? And again, I will just say that NAACP National has been very, very involved. But anything else you want to say about that?
Yeah. So yes. So if National is already put that out, and this is just for the local branches to understand too. That's why we get our leadership from National. If National has already identified different organizations and also put out press releases on different things that we can advocate for, it is your leadership within the local to actually go ahead and send out a press release for your local people to know. The biggest thing to know do is to lead in the effort and communicate with your community. Remember, we're all in jurisdictions, so be familiar with what's going on in your jurisdiction. The difference between what DeKalb is doing and what Fulton is doing is that Fulton and Atlanta does they understand what's going on in Fulton and Atlanta, which will be different from what we're doing in DeKalb County. So it really is important that if this is an issue or concern for your community, please take on the initiative to lead in the effort for your people.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, Teresa. It's just great information and great leadership on this incredibly important issue. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
All right, take care. Okay, now we will move on in our agenda to updates from the Erase project and rental arrears to stop evictions. And I think we're going to be starting with Sarah Gallagher, the Erase Senior Project Director. Are we starting with you, Sarah?
You are, Paul. Thanks.
Okay, great.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Hi, everybody. Wow, what great information today. I'm completely overwhelmed and impressed with all of the work. So you can go to the next slide for me. What I want to share with folks today, I think Paul and Sarah, as mentioned earlier in the call, are some tools and framings to think about state and bringing all of this work together into state and local actions that we can all take over the next few weeks to ensure we're really preparing for the end of the moratorium in the counties that it is still available in, and really creating a path to success for the ERA programs. So the first resource I wanted to share with you is the Erase checklists. And we've probably heard about them before, but they're all available online now. And here is the link. And what the Erase checklists are is the team here at NLHC research and policy and field team really worked together to pull together the guidance from Treasury, emerging research that we've been working on, innovations from the field, such as you've heard today, and working with all of the partners to really create the framework that would, one, ensure assistance is delivered quickly to those most in need, and then two, develop the framework and infrastructure for scale and sustainability long-term. And so when you go to the checklist, they are organized in the Erase framework, which is visible, accessible, and preventive. And our hope is that allow you to do a couple of things. Like one, it'll help you to make quick assessment of your emergency rental assistance program if you're an administrator, or your state or local emergency rental assistance program if you are a user of that program, or if you're an advocate trying to advocate for changes, or if you're a policymaker, to really look at what's being implemented. It'll lay out the attributes and strategies for best practice and what we think really makes successful program implementation. And then two, offer strategies for partnership development and course correction if you feel like you want to make changes, or if you feel like there's ways that your programs could be more successful. Next slide. So yeah, next slide. So please visit that website and you'll be able to download those in PDF form. The second resource I wanted to share with folks, as you may know, that we've taken the checklist and the framework and developed a 3-part webinar series. And this week is the last in our series. So we have our webinar on Preventive, connecting emergency rental assistance to courts and tenant protections. And we heard a lot about that today. And so in this webinar, we hope to highlight strategies to prevent eviction, to prevent housing displacement and homelessness, but really offering flexible, holistic preventive interventions and creating formal partnerships with state and local court systems, and really focusing on tenant protections. We'll hear from Christine Soman from the Department of Justice, Zach Zarno from the National Center for State Courts, and then we'll hear from 4 local programs, Samira Nazim from the Chicago Bar Foundation, Jay Rose, who helped with some of the Wind Company's framework, Webb Brewer, and then Greg Payne from Maine Affordable Housing Coalition, and Webb Brewers from Memphis and Shelby County. So please, we'll put a link in the chat. Please join us if you can. And if you can't, we will always make sure to have those webinars available to you online afterwards. Okay, next slide. So as you heard today, what can we do? We've heard a lot around what we can do. And I think we've heard a lot today around the needs of tenants and landlords as they move across the system. So what I wanted to talk about for a second is just highlight the need of ensuring multiple streamlined ways for assistance from across the continuum, from the point when someone experiences a financial crisis, to when an eviction may be filed in court, all the way up to potential housing loss and homelessness. And why this is important to highlight is because households in needs and households with multiple barriers really must be able to access emergency rental assistance at the time when they need it most. And so ensuring that ERA is available across this continuum is extremely important, because we can't decide when somebody needs assistance most. We really need to keep offering assistance to tenants and landlords to when they may need it most, and so when they can take advantage of it. And so I just want to put this framework out here. So as we're talking and we're hearing from different programs, we keep in mind different intervention points and how we might want to intersect with those. Next slide, please. So one of the things I did want to talk about is some immediate actions that we can take, that state and local administrators can take, state and local policymakers can take, and then what ERA programs can do themselves. So first of all, from a state and local policy framework, with the newly surging Delta variant, low vaccination rates, and in communities that often have high eviction filings and slow rates of distribution, we see that the need for state and local eviction moratorium continues and is clear. So really encouraging that state and local policymakers keep this in mind and really work towards keeping state and local eviction moratorium. And these should really coincide with vaccination rates, with COVID rates in your community, and allow time for state and local governments to ramp up their programs, to distribute funds to those most in need, and really ensure that the ERA programs are working at this as well as they could be. This really brings me to the second point on our list here, in that, really highlighting the need to distribute emergency rental funds quickly. Emma will talk about this a little bit later, but as of the end of June and into July, a little over $3 billion of the $46 billion in emergency rental assistance funding had been spent. And we really have seen many states and localities making significant progress and making some of the changes that need to be made to ensure that funding is getting out, but there's clearly more that needs to be done. And we really encourage state and local programs and stakeholders to focus on ensuring that all the programs are visible, they're accessible, and they're really focused on preventive mechanisms. Third, we want to make sure that safeguards are in place to ensure that the eviction process ensures time for landlords and tenants to access ERA, and to ensure coordination once the application is in process. So this really talks to having policies in place that make sure landlords can evict if an application is pending, that it postpones hearings or gives renters time to apply if they are behind on rent, and that if people do receive assistance, they're not evicted in the next 60 to 90 days. So making sure that there's policy and practice in place to have those things happen. And then lastly, making sure states and localities are working on other measures such as right to counsel or expungement of eviction records that can really help renters now, but in the long term. So making sure you're working with your state legislature to enact additional rental and tenant protections as soon as possible, and that they're really in line with the ERA programs. Next slide, please. So that's really thinking about sort of what your state and local policymakers can do, but then we want to highlight some of the items that ERA program administrators can do right now. And the checklist will really talk through some of this and really highlight some of the areas around ensuring directed tenant assistance is available, using categorical eligibility and proxies, really minimizing some of the paperwork and documentation and process that's needed to streamline the timeline. But we want to highlight some of the other areas that we think are extremely important, especially as we come to thinking about at the end of the moratorium. So with the possibility of states and local courts processing and hearing a greater number of cases, finding right now it's extremely crucial to be engaging with attorneys, judges, justice of peace, court and other court staff, and making sure they're active partners with the landlords and with tenants to connect with the assistance that is needed. Some of the strategies that we're highlighting are increasing communication efforts in the court system. We want to make sure that state and local courts know about ERA, that they're making sure that tenants and landlords have access to information, that when a court is issuing a summons or giving information about a hearing, that they're including information on emergency rental assistance, and that information is included on all of the court's websites, and there's active links to applications, there's phone numbers available so that people can access applications when they need them. We've been talking a lot about implementing data sharing between courts and ERA programs, and we heard a little bit about that actually earlier in the call today. It's really important that the courts understand who is most at risk of eviction and where households are, both in the eviction process, but also in the ERA process. This is helpful so that we can slow the processes and really prevent housing loss. So we're encouraging ERA programs and courts to work together to identify cases possibly where a landlord may have had an eviction case, they did an application and maybe they received payment and were made whole, but the filing was not revoked. So giving that information to the courts so that they know that this case has been paid and they can close it out without evicting a tenant. Or understanding that someone, the landlord or the tenant, is in the application process and they just need a little bit more time for that payment to be made. And so that eviction should be held until that payment can be made. So that data and communication is extremely important to make sure that that process is clear. The third area, which many ERA programs are starting to do really well, is to have a presence in court. You know, it's hard right now. So it could be virtual, it could be in person if courts are in person and there's safety protocol in place, but really having that presence to offer community navigation or court navigation to tenants and landlords so that they know about the emergency rental assistance in real time and when they need it. Having support to complete an application, having support to access mediation and to know when funding is available, and then really building that relationship with presiding chiefs and judges so that they know that there's other options out on the table that can really help support the process. Related to that is that programs can start to fast track applications that are filed in court or with a navigator or that are really high on the queue for eviction so that those applications can really go through an expedited process. In order to make this happen, our recommendation here is to really look at utilizing the administrative allocations and the housing navigation allocations to increase staffing. That staffing could be legal staff to help with some of the cases, could be court navigators or housing navigators, but really creating the infrastructure with your ERA programs now so that you can have really efficient and processes that are moving quickly and there's no bottleneck due to lack of funding. And then lastly, that's not on the slide, is creating your tables in the partnerships and building relationships. Really thinking about that slide before that talked about the continuum and engaging all the partners who are part of or play a role in that continuum. So engaging your Office of Housing, engaging your program administrators, your homeless and housing coalitions, your legal aid attorneys, engaging your senators and your legislators, and engaging health centers and other places that are seeing people who might be in need now. So you're creating that table that is really problem solving and is creating that continuum and that infrastructure. Next slide. The last thing I'll mention before I hand it over to Emma is that while we're creating these really effective and efficient programs, that we're thinking about additional supports that may be needed to ensure housing stability. As we move forward in this process, we may find households that are closer to entering homelessness or may have entered homelessness already due to eviction or housing loss. And so connecting your programs and your processes and resources to your local continuum of care, to your homelessness diversion and prevention programs and your coordinated entry will be crucial for rehousing purposes and to create that ability to support people and finding new homes if need be. We want to encourage ERA programs to be talking with rental, long-term rental subsidy resources that are available or may be becoming available to be able to provide longer-term interventions or more supports for households who may have greater needs. They may have a long history of chronic homelessness. They may have a history of a chronic health condition or disability, something that may require longer-term assistance, and using ERA to provide that bridge will be extremely helpful. And then coordinating with case management or financial assistance or employment support to really think about housing stability in the long term, so that we can create that path for families to thrive. So that's what I have on our recommendations now. Like I said, check out our checklists and check out our webinars so that you can dive deeper into all of these areas, and happy to answer any questions. My email is sgallagher@nlhc.org, and happy to reach out and talk to you further. But with that, I'm going to hand it over to Emma, who's going to dive into some of our resources and some of the latest numbers related to the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I know we're at 4:01, and so I'll try to be efficient, but I just wanted to highlight a few updated emergency rental assistance resources that we have available. So the first is that we have updated our emergency rental assistance dashboard, which can be accessed at nlhc.org/ERA-dashboard. And I think that someone will pop that in the chat. And the dashboard has been updated to include which programs are covering other housing expenses outside of rent and utility payments. These are broken up into several categories informed by Treasury's guidance on the other permissible uses for emergency rental assistance. And the categories that we're tracking include relocation expenses, late fees, hotel motel stays, internet costs, and other uncategorized expenses. We've identified that 47% of programs are using emergency rental assistance for at least one type of other housing expense, with internet costs being the most common, followed by relocation expenses. On the dashboard page, users can also see which programs are explicitly allowing each type of expense below the dashboard. Next slide. And at the bottom of the ERA dashboard, we've also added a thermometer to track how quickly ERA1 funds are being spent out of the total $25 billion allocation. Currently, NLHC is tracking that 15.5% of funds have been spent, but notably, this doesn't account for funding expended by tribes or tribally designated housing entities, because these data are not yet available from the Department of Treasury. This spending thermometer will be updated weekly and will eventually also show ERA2 numbers. The bottom of the tracker links to a Google spreadsheet where more disaggregated spending data can be found. Next slide. And I've posted here a shortened link to the Google spreadsheet. The spreadsheet itself contains several different sheets with data displayed in a variety of ways. The first sheet has data aggregated together for all of the programs that we have spending data for, broken up by state, locality, and territory programs. The second sheet has data at the program level for all programs that host a real-time data dashboard and includes links to those dashboards as well as some high-level numbers. And then lastly, there's a spreadsheet with the most recent data available for each of the state emergency rental assistance programs. This data comes from a few different sources, and we try to use the most updated data available for each program. Data sources for this sheet include the U.S. Department of Treasury program reports, program dashboard data, data from administrators and advocates, and news articles. Next slide. The spreadsheet also contains a couple data visualizations to compare how state programs are doing, such as this one, which shows the percent of ERA1 funding distributed by state program. If you have any comments or questions about the data, please feel free to reach out to research@nlihc.org. And also, if you know of any dashboards that aren't on the list, you can send a link to that same address, research@nlihc.org, and we will add them. Again, this is a living document, so open to any updates or comments that you all have, and I will turn it back over to Paul.
Okay, great. Thank you both, Emma and Sarah. I will say we had lots of questions come in. Quite honestly, a number of them are about kinds of things that will be touched on during Wednesday's webinar. So we don't have time to answer those questions now, but number one, we always look at the questions that come in, and they help inform what we do in terms of our FAQs and other resources on our website and things that we touch on during these calls. But also, I just really want to encourage everybody to please attend the Wednesday webinar from the Erase Project, which will get into all of the work that you can do, advocacy work and other work to encourage preventative efforts in your states and localities to prevent people from experiencing eviction and homelessness. So please join that. The other thing I just want to make sure I tell everybody again, as Sarah Sadian said at the beginning, please, now is the time to be reaching out to your members of Congress and ensuring that the HoUSed campaign priorities are included in the reconciliation package that is now moving forward in the Senate and soon in the House. Please do all you can to push forward those priorities. Make sure that housing for people with the lowest incomes is prioritized, and that affordable housing in general receives the highest allocation possible. So thank you all to our panelists who were fantastic today, and to everybody who joined us on today's call. Really appreciate it, and we look forward to talking to you next week. Take care, everybody. Thank you.